come close to me if you want to hear, which is good. So you guys can, get closer. You know the drill. Well, it's a new drill, but now you know. So welcome back to the Sunken Blimp Stage. Today we have prepared for you guys a workshop, actually. So this is the first of a next, series of workshops, which are called Dive Live workshops. And within this next, 30 to 40 minutes, I'm going to show today light baking, which is a concept that, a lot of you might know if you're into, modeling, Blender, game design, even architecture. But nonetheless, if you're thinking about virtual spaces, this is something that is very important because real-time lighting is not something that a lot of servers can do for multiplayer, environments like this, and a lot of, platforms that are coming up, such as Spatial, the space that we're in right now. They don't really support real-time lighting, so we have to fake it, right? And that's something that in the world of design is not necessarily the priority, right, that is taught to us. So even in architecture, I personally have never had this mentioned to me. I never heard about light baking until I was in a space like this and I had to figure out how to, make the space look nicer. So just a quick introduction, right, for anyone that is their first time here. My name is Matheus Stancati. I'm one of the co-founders of Sunken Blimp. And Dive Lives are events that we do every Friday here at the Sunken Blimp Stage, where we usually bring a speaker to talk about a different topic. In the Dive Live, they have like 20 to 30 minutes to talk about something. Think about a TED Talk, right, in a virtual space. And that's what we've been doing for, these past amazing 3.5 months. And then today we're going to do this workshop taught by me. So I hope you guys enjoy. And then now for us to get started, I will do a quick introduction about 3D files and 3D objects itself, because we have a new type of budget, right? If real world building and real world products, they have a budget regarding materials, etc. When you think about digital objects, you don't necessarily have a budget, right? An object could be made of entirely gold and it doesn't change anything. But the new budget is the file size, right, and poly count, and how you can make the smallest size file for the 3D object as possible, but still remaining quality. So if you guys want to follow me here, I'll do a quick introduction, which I was preparing a slideshow, and then I thought, what the heck, right? We're in the virtual space, so let me do a 3D object instead. So this is to show an example of default cube, right? And digital objects, they're made of, mainly like three things for the actual object itself, which are the vertices, right? The points, which we have in the first demonstration here, and then the edges, which are the lines that make the object, and then the surfaces, which are the faces of what the object is. And then with that, the object is constructed, right? Separate from materials. This is the object. And then from that, you can have different variations of the same object, with less or more face counts. So for example, here I modeled a Mobius strip, which Mobius strips, for those that don't know, is just a continuous surface, right, that goes around and then it turns to the other side and it never ends. And then on this first example, right, this is a very simple model with only 64 faces. And this model itself is 6 kilobytes. So way less than 1 megabyte, right? So it's a very, very low file. It doesn't have any materials, but only 64 faces. That's a very low number, which runs perfectly. Didn't have time to load in the space, for example. And then we have a more defined model on the side, and this one has 256 faces. And then you start getting a little bit more definition, but you can clearly see each of the faces. And then we move on a little bit more detailed. We have 1,024 faces. This one. So then you see more of the curves, and this file size is 71 kilobytes, which is still very low. And then we have this final one, which is way more, quote unquote, subdivided. And this one has 16,000 faces, which is not necessarily too big, right? Considering the space that we're in right now, we have way more than that. But now with this amount of faces, then you can see the curvature is very smooth, and something, especially if you're doing quote unquote organic designs, etc. You want to have a very smooth face, but at the same time, how to reduce like poly count. So it's usually a conversation or a dance between smaller poly counts and higher, some details that you want to showcase the curvature, etc. But that's something that it really depends from design. And then basically this doesn't have any materials, but then for you to add textures or materials, it's not as simple as on a 3D software, just dragging a material and that's it, because you have to think of a UV mapping. So for those that don't know what a UV mapping is, it's basically how to unfold the geometry. And in this cube, it shows an example. And now I realize that all of these textures look like crosses on the stage. This is by no means any religious reference. This is a model of the cube, and next to it, the texture that corresponds to it. So each of these faces of the cube are then flattened on this texture. What that means is if you add a texture of, for example, a box and you flatten it out, now you have a file that stores all of the information of what this 3D model reconstruction will look like. But then this, for example, is only the textures with no lighting, right? So this is the texture that it shows here. And there's no shadows, not really much of a sense of belonging to the space. Or if you have, for example, a lamp or some light fixtures, from other objects, this looks a little alienated because it's not responding to the surrounding itself. So then the idea of light baking, and this is a demonstration with painting, right? Light baking is basically allowing the lights to paint onto the texture what you want to showcase. So in this case, this is literally drawn by me. It looks like it was drawn by a 6-year-old, but I drew some like patterns or something just to showcase whatever additions you make to the texture is then, updated into the 3D model. So what that allows us to do is then fake lighting. So in this case, for example, there is the Sunken Blimp logo, right? And the Sunken Blimp logo is, glowing. And then the texture, once we bake it, it has the updated, glow of the logo onto the texture. So then, when you add it into a virtual space or even an augmented reality platform to make like Instagram filters or something, you don't have to process lighting in real time because that's, written within the materials of the objects. And then on this other example, we have, the shell lamp by Serendipity Furniture, which is a design we're doing with Serendipity. And then we have the lighting that comes from the shell, the way that it emits written within the texture. So then you can mimic, you can create the effect that there's a light in there, even though it's just pixels, coloration on the wood itself. So with that idea, I wanted to bring forward this other example where this is the portal or the gate, let's call it, that we used for last week's dive live with Jake. And the way that the model was done, we had to keep a very low poly count in this case, or the amount of faces, because we are going to we repeated this gate many times throughout the stage. So we had to have a very low file size. So then the model itself has about 4,000 polygons each of these gates. And then all of the information are stored within the texture. So if you look here, there's this glowing light from the center where the portals were, and that was a light that was baked into this. And then we used a lighting around the gate that had this bluish hue. So then it feels like it's belonging to the environment of the stage, right? Because all of these other examples that you can see, they don't have any blue hue whatsoever because they were baked without this. But baking with the blue coloration, it mimics the stone of the stage itself and the lighting around, which is the HDRI, right? Which is the environmental lighting. And then on this side, we have what the texture looks like, right? When it's baked. And then here, this is the normal bake. So the normal bake kind of allows the gate to have this stone texture. And it mimics it actually creates the effect of lighting associated with the bumps and all of these irregularities of the stone, etc. So this is, in a way, the result, what you can get from light baking. And then here at the end, the same way that I was showing the Mobius strips, right? These are two examples of the Mobius strips with even more resolution and the actual texture. And then the important part to think about is that file size does not only depend on the poly count and the amount of vertices, faces. It depends on the size of your texture, right? Because the bigger the image is of the texture, the more file size. But at the same time, if you make it too low, you're going to have problems with how the texture looks. And if you guys get close and actually enter one of these and look closely, you can see that there are irregularities within the texture. Because both of these were somewhat small, texture sizes. So 1024 by 1024 pixels. And that doesn't allow for the amount of faces that there are here, doesn't allow for a lot of detail when it comes to the baking itself. So this is a quick introduction about what is baking for those that don't really know. And then I will like to share my screen and show you guys, a quick process for baking using Blender. So before we start, I have a question. Is anyone's first time using Blender or haven't used Blender much? You can clap or react with. All right, I think I saw one person reacting. Is that JR? Have you not used Blender before? Well, I couldn't hear you, but. Well, so what I'm gonna do is I'll share my screen and I'll go slowly through the process. So you guys are more than welcome to follow along, or if you prefer to watch it later as well, this is gonna be recorded. And then if you have questions, you can, if it's a small question or a quick one, you can ask. But then if you have like major questions or other inquiries, I would just ask to kind of hold on to those, and I'll have a couple of checkpoints, checking if you guys need anything or have any questions, and then we can solve those questions. All right. So I'm gonna go here. So make sure you open Blender, and then. Right, there we go. So hello, we're in Blender now. So quick thing for anyone that is entering Blender right now, right? This is what you see when you first open it. This is the default cube that is always there with us forever. Right here we have a camera, we have a light, and then here on the side you can see all of the objects that are in your space. So for example, you can select from here or you can select on the cube, right? Whatever you want to select. Right now we're not going to need the camera, so we can select that and delete, and we're not going to need the light right now. And the cube, we can get rid of it. So now we have a open slate to start with. So first, we're going to add a plane, which is going to be our floor. So for that, you can hold Shift A, and that opens a panel that you can select. You can go into Mesh and add a plane, right? So now we have our little plane there. If you hold S, it scales, right? If you press R, it rotates, and if you press G, you can move it around. So remember that S scales, R rotates, and G moves it around. And then if you want to move it in a specific axis, for example, you can press Y to move it in the Y axis. X, it goes into the X axis, and then Z, it goes on the Z, which is up and down. So now that we have a plane, let's just scale this up. So like 10 times. So I'll press S for scale, and I'll type 10 and enter, right? As you can see, we have the plane here. So what I always like to do is double click and rename it. So let's name it floor. And then for this test, I'm going to do a somewhat of a space, or in a way architectural, but not really. I'm not going to spend much time with the modeling so I can show the baking itself. So what we're going to do is go back to do the same thing we did before, Shift A to open the menu. And then we're going to select a torus, which is a round donut shape. So when you edit, before you click on anything else, see that there's a panel here. This is a panel that you can only access when you first create a shape. And if you click on something else, you kind of lose it. But this allows you to change something moved on the stage. All right. Okay, so adding a torus, Shift A, add a torus, and then how you can change the amount of segments that you have on the major segments and then the minor segments as well. So let's see, let's add like 12 segments like this and 8. 10 segments like this. I think that's fine. And I would like this to let's make like a gallery type of space. So for this, as you can see, the torus is going through this plane, which is their floor, right? So we only want the top part, kind of like a circular gallery. So let's delete that, right? So what you can do is when you're holding the middle mouse button to pan around, if you hold Alt while you do it to a specific view. So let's say you went from the front and you hold Alt, you snap into this view, right? And then if you hit Tab, you go into edit mode. And on edit mode, like we were talking about in the introduction, you have like the vertices, which you can select and move particular vertices. You have the edges, so you can modify the geometry by the edges, and you have the faces as well, right? So right now, let's select the faces on edit mode, and then let's snap so you can see it right in front of it. And then this little button on the top allows you to select things in an X-ray mode. So you toggle that on and off, or you can go into actual X-ray view, right? And with that selected, what you can do is select everything that is on the bottom half, right? And you can get out of it to just double check that everything's selected. And then you just hit delete and delete the faces. So now if we go back to the shading view, which is here up top, you can see that there's only, let's just double check for to see, there's only like the top part of that. All right, so now that we only have the top, we can create like a quick entrance for this. So one thing that I like to do, if you see the model, the actual like points of the torus, they're right on the axis. And I usually like having a flat face on it so we can modify. So what I'll do is go to the top and then click R for rotation, and then Z just to make sure that it's on the Z axis. And then I'll rotate 15 degrees, which since we're divided by 12, a little bit of math, who would have thought? Rotate 15 degrees so we have like this front. And then what I'll do is kind of lift only the front part. So that's kind of like the entrance of the gallery, right? So right now I selected the torus again and I hit Tab so we can modify things. So if I select all of the faces, right, on this side, and I move them up, pressing G to move up and then Z for the Z axis, you can see that it kind of creates this somewhat of an entrance, which, it's something that we can do more detail with more time, but I just want to make a little bit, fast. And then what I will do is hit A to select all, and then press G again, so it goes up on the Z axis. And this is something that if you click on the rendered view, you can see a little bit better. Oh, we deleted the light. Wait, don't do that yet. So if you see here, oh yeah, this is how much we moved it up, right? It was right on the line, and then we moved up a bit. And the one thing that I want to do is actually select the surface in the bottom and extrude it again, so we have a little bit more editing capability. So I'll go on to the Edges tab, and then hitting Alt, you can select everything. And then hitting Alt and Shift, you can select the inner part as well. So if you select both of these and you hit E, that's extrude, and then you can bring it down. So have I lost anyone already? Like, is anyone, um, you know, am I going too fast or am I going too slow? Right. So no answer is a good answer, I guess. All right, I'll just keep going. But if I'm going too fast, just let me know. Um, so now that we extruded this, I just want to make an opening towards the back as well. So imagine, I'm thinking like if this is a gallery that you kind of walk in through here, so you can go inside, and this is somewhat of a courtyard. I just want to make another opening so there's more ways of entering the courtyard. So let's say I take this edge that we just extruded in the bottom, we move it up, right? There's a little bit of that. And then let's create some openings on the sides too, so there's some light coming in for the baking, some nice highlights. So right now I hold Alt and then click on the edge. So it selects the entire ring of surfaces, and I hold Shift as well so we can select the other side. And then let's add some holes here. So the hallway is now like super dark. So I'm gonna press I for insert, and that inserts a surface, right? But if I do this, the surface that it inserts is everywhere. So I press I again, so it's individual surfaces. And then a size like this should be good. And then delete faces. So now this is somewhat of our gallery. There's a main entrance, so you can go through the ring, and then there's light coming in here, another opening, light coming from in here. So now if we look at I press shift to get out. If you look at the rendered view, there's no whatsoever, so we can hit shift A to bring a light. Let's bring the sun in. So once you bring the sun, you can see the sun is kind of like down here. You can move it up by pressing G um, and then Z to move on the Z axis. And the sun, this is a very like midday, coming straight down. So one thing that you can do is rotate it, right? And you can press R for rotating, and you can rotate on the Y axis. So you control how much it goes there. Say this is good. And then I can rotate on the Z axis. So I can choose where the light is coming from. Let's do something like this. So some light goes into here. And then you can see that the lights, the shadows are really kind of bad. And that's because we're using Eevee as the renderer, right? If you go here on the camera icon, we can change the render engine from Eevee to cycles. So this is like a heads up. If your computer doesn't have a good GPU or something, chances are that this is a bit, not problematic, but a little bit slower. But for the light baking, this is usually what we want to go with. So you can choose the cycles as the rendering engine. And then just real quick, we can change the max samples, which is how many passes it does in the viewport to 64. That's the rendering that we see. And then for the rendering itself, we can change it to 256 for now. We don't have to change much. So this is, kind of like this catch of this gallery space. We can already see some light coming in. Even if you go into this space, the, the light that is fused statistics, which already have up. So if you have that on, it always shows you how many are in your project, how many faces, how many triangles. And then once you go into edit mode, which you can go by pressing tab, you see the information about that model itself, right? So even if you select to 35 out of 126, etc. So this is always good to have, so you can control how many faces you have as your model. So let's say that we want this to be, let's say we add some lights, right? This is what we're here for. Let's say this is a gallery, and let's say you don't have time to make like something more refined. Let's say you want to make this into your gallery. So what we're going to do is add some lights inside. So Shift A, and then under lights, let's put a spotlight, right? And then you can move it up. So this is a spotlight, and then you can control the settings here. Once you create it, there's a object data properties with a little lamp icon. And here you can change the color of the light, how much the spotlight opens, and the intensity, right? So let's say 100, very strong spotlight. And then now we can move this into space. So if you press G, you can actually move it inside. Let's see inside. So let's say this is like the spotlight you want to do, and you can increase the oof. Here, like increase like this. Let's say you have sporadic spotlights through this. Um, one thing that you can do is after doing this, you can go back to a view that doesn't take much of your computer power, or even this. I like doing this in wireframe mode because then you can see the floor, kind of like the plan of this or the boundaries of the space, and then holding G, you can move it again, right? And then for us to duplicate the spotlights around, one thing that we can do is hold Alt D. So that duplicates an object, but they're all linked, right? So you can modify one and all of the lamps would modify. So if I do this here and then I Alt D again, let's copy it around the stage, the stage, no, the gallery, right? So a couple of these. And then once you go into the render view again, you can see that there are some lights already inside. And then if you select one of them and you change the color to like blue, purple, all of the lights updated once. So that's the good thing about using the Alt G to duplicate. So let's say this is what we want to do. I'm going to save the file, which I recommend. I'm going to save it as gallery 3, and then so now that's the part of the poly count, right? So let's say if this is our actual model, you could experiment. Let's say you want something more curvy. Within Blender, you can do a bunch of different modifiers, such as, for example, solidify, which is going to add some thickness to your model. So right now we only had a surface, so we can come in here and actually add thickness to the walls, etc. Whatever modifications you would do, and then, for example, subdivision. And then with subdivision, you can actually smooth it out and bring it to a more like curvy type of geometry. And this is the thing that you can increase, to make it smoother. Every time you add a level, it makes it smoother and smoother and smoother. But then look at our triangle count. We're already like at 170,000 triangles. If we subdivide it again, that's like over 500,000. If we subdivide it again, that's like 2,700,000. And if I do it again, I'm pretty sure my computer will crash, so I'm not going to do that. So this is the dance between curvature and poly count, right? Ideally you want to have the smallest possible, but if I go smaller than that, now the geometry itself, it's a different shape. It's not curvy at all, like these holes, etc. So let's keep it on 2 for now. And this is a non-destructive way of doing this, right? Because I can always toggle between the curvy and the non-curvy, and go back and forth depending on what I need. So right now, let's say we have this. If we go take a look at what the model looks like, and we turn the curvature on, we have some light coming from the inside. We have some lights coming from the skylights and the openings. Let's say we want to bake that, right? The first thing we need to do is actually bring some materials into the game. I'm not going to go into how to get materials, etc. But something that I really recommend is Blender Assets, I think it's called, which is a plugin that you can download. It's free, right? And there's a bunch of free textures within, but then If you want more textures and access to like everything, you can pay, which is like $9 a month. We're not sponsored by them, but like it's honestly like a very helpful tool because you can just like look at different materials, select and drag into what you're working on. So let's say we want to do like a stone texture, kind of like the same idea that we're doing with the Sunken Blimp Stage. Um, so kind of something like this, right? Like a very rough, porous type of stone. From with this plugin, you can just drag and drop. And by the way, if you don't have the plugin, don't worry, we can still do the baking with the lights. So if you don't have any textures right now, you can still bake. Um, so yeah, right now with this texture, go into this mode. You see that it's a bit like stretched. You know, we can fix that. The way that you can see the texture is once the object is clicked on the material property, you know, you have here the stone granite, which you can modify a couple of things, but there's way more things that you can do within the shading tab up top. So if you click on the shading tab, you have here kind of like the material nodes, right? And this is where we have the textures for this material. So the stone granite, for example, it has a color texture, which looks like this. It has the roughness and the normal that creates the bumps. So right now, these are all this size. So if I go and unwrap the material, which means that you're creating the UV, right? The same way that those cross-looking shapes were there with the material unfolded, you can do that to this geometry. This tab, right, is called UV editing. And if you select everything by pressing A, you can see where each face of your object is currently. So, for example, this face, right? It's represented as a cube. That's why it looks stretched out because it's not understanding that it's not a square. It's actually like a long rectangle. So then when you look at the texture itself, it looks, stretched. So what we can do is, with the UV editing open that you can see both, you can press A and then the letter U for UV mapping. And then one thing that is always good to use is the smart UV project. So it's going to calculate what is the best, displacement or organization of these. Once you click, you're going to have a menu. So don't worry about that because there's also a menu when you click OK. So you see that it organizes the textures um, into the texture itself. So if you click here on the menu, you can actually modify a couple of things. This is like the angle limit, which is like how much the textures can like separate from each other, but like don't worry about this too much. So right now we can go ahead and let's press OK for now. Let's see how it looks. This is pretty good for now. And as you can see, like the stone texture itself is too big for the scale. It looks like it's a small object compared to like an actual space. So on the shading panel, we can fake the size of the UV without changing the UV that we have for the object. So this is a bit technical in a way, but it saves lives. So this is the texture, right, that is associated with this material. Instead of changing the size of the texture itself, we can change the vector of how the texture is applied to the material. So with that, we can use Shift A, that opens the menu, right, the same way that it does on the other page. And then you can look for mapping, right? And then for the vector that goes into the mapping node is going to be under input and then texture coordinate. So basically from this, we can bring in the UV, which is the UV we created, into vector. And then we can connect the vector to the albedo, which is with the texture of the material, right? What that does is now we can control the scale. So let's say if I do 10 by 10, now we have a way smaller like effect on the texture onto this. Um, and then we have to do the same thing for the other texture. So you can just bring this vector in for the roughness and the normal, and the last one, the height. So within texture and UV itself, there's other things that I'm not going to touch upon since we're trying to do baking, but there's ways of creating seams so you can control where the texture starts and ends. Much like clothing, right? So we can say that this is a whole piece instead of splitting here, etc. But yeah, let's say this is what we want to bake for now, right? And if we look at the rendered view, there's the lighting, kind of going on to the stone. And then let's say we want to add a spotlight right at the entrance. I'll just copy one of these. So instead of Alt A, since I'm going to do a different spotlight, I'll do Shift D. So that copy without being made to the other ones. Let's say I want to add the spotlight somewhere here. And this will be like a warm tone. So you see how the stone picks up on, the shadows. Like it kind of makes up shadows with the normal map, which is basically what the normal map does. So let's say we want to bake this environment as we have right now. So one thing that we need to do to write the lights into the texture is to add a new image to the texture that we have. So if you select the object and you go into the shading, this is the stone granite we have. I'll add Shift A to add an image. In the search bar, you can type image texture. And then here is the image that we're going to create, right? So if you select a new one, you can call this bake stone 1. This is where you can select the size of the texture that you want to do. So the higher the image, the more time it's going to take to bake, and the larger is going to be the file size. And then the rest we can leave it alone, and then okay, right? So this is where we're going to bake this texture to. And the texture is going to be a square image, right? And it has this, mapping on it. Right now, all of these shapes, there's still the flat one, right? Without the curvature. So before we actually bake, we can go back and I'll create a copy of this so we don't lose the ability of going back to the simple geometry. And then on this one, we can apply these modifications. So I'll go into apply the one that makes it thicker, and then apply the subdivisions, right? So now if we look at UV editing, now we have all of the different stones here, but they're still following the shape of the straight one. So we have to do it again is A for selecting everything, U for UV mapping, and then Smart Project. And now you're going to see that the actual shape changes, right? And the more pieces that you can have on the same chunk, the better. And it's usually like a fight between like how much of the image you can use, right? Because all of this is like data that you're wasting. Because like, let's say this is a very large image, so this is very detailed. This is space that is pretty much unused, but they still account for the file size. So you can kind of play around to see how much you can fit within this one texture. And then also add some margins. So you see how like a texture is touching the other. You can add like 0.003 or something, or 0.05. So there's a little bit of spacing between one and the other. All right, so once we have that, we can go back to shading where we had our texture. And then with this set, we can go into the rendering tab, and then all the way to the bottom, or like almost at the bottom, you can see the tab that is called Bake. And this is going to be what we use to bake it. So once you select the image and the model is selected, you can go ahead and bake, and then it's going to start the process of baking. Right now, there's not a lot of lights and a lot of objects, so it's not taking long. But once you start, implementing a lot of different parts to this and all, this process can take like a very long time. One of the one of the models that we're doing for the stage, for a stage implementation, it's not that the file is heavy, but there's so many different points, and we're trying to make such a high quality baking that some of the images take like up to like 5 minutes to bake, um, which that alone is not that much compared to like other projects. But yeah, so here, this is what the baking looks like now. So it has, here the entrance light, how it looks. We have the red lighting inside. So for you to test, the one thing that you can do is simply apply this image that we just baked into the node of the texture itself. So instead of the base color being the texture of the stone, we can actually add the baking. I usually like to duplicate the material that you can do here, so we're not messing up with the original material. And then from here, I'm gonna connect color to color base. And then you can even leave the rendered mode, right, to kind of do a double check. So now none of these lights, they're actually working. Um, and this is like the bake result only. So the effects of the lighting being replicated here. There's a couple of things popping up here, and I'm pretty sure because of the size of the spotlight is like massive, and it's kind of bleeding through. But I think you get the idea, right? And then once you baked, one thing that you can never forget to do is hit N. That opens up this panel, and on the image you have to save the image somewhere. So I'll just write, bake stone 1, saved, and now that it's saved, it's associated with this file, with this texture. Another thing that we can do is bake let's just bake the normals. I'll bake the floor first, so we have the shadows, and we can test it on Spatial. So right now, let's say this floor is here. I'll make it a little bit smaller so we don't waste a lot of space, right? And then we're gonna bake the lighting on this floor. So as you can imagine, the UV associated with this floor is just a square. So we don't have to do any unmapping for this, because it's just one surface. And on shading, it doesn't have a material, so we're gonna add one. Let's call this floor. And we can leave the floor as this, just so we can see the shadows itself. So everything is white in the template. So Shift A to open up the panel. I'll search for image texture. Here we're gonna create a new image, and let's call this floor bake 1. Floor bay. With this selected, we're going to the rendering tab, and then where there's the bake, we bake. Does anyone have any questions so far? Or is anyone able to follow this, or you guys are just watching and like not really doing it together? All right, so this is the floor. So we save it again, the texture. And then out here, I'll bring the color to base color. Now, if we check it, yeah, there's some lights, already incorporated into this. Is that a question, or is just a dance to support baking? I'll believe it's a dance to support the baking. All right, so we modeled a quick, gallery or something. Let's bring this bad boy into Spatial and check it out. Right now, there's no. Okay, so the map. Okay, let's map the normal first, real quick. So one thing that is missing is there's no texture of the stone, right? This is the texture that is within. It's not really baked. So we'll create another image. So we can just Shift D and then erase this one, and I'll do bake stone normal. Um, and then here on under the bake, instead of baking it, again as is, we'll change this to normal. Then we can bake. So you see now it created like all of this, and this is a small file size just for the sake of speed, but it's a bit pixelated the texture, but still it's something to give some roughness to the stone. So we'll save that and associate this with the normal map node. So like I mentioned, all right, so the normal map, you can bring this into, here's a bump. So you see, this is pixelated, right? So that's why like the stone roughness itself, it doesn't really read as much. Um, but that's something if we want to bake as a larger file size. So let's say bake um, look at 248, 248. All right. Um, so bake. And if this is not working right now, just bring it so we can see it in Spatial, and then I can do a video later on just finalizing this part. But the idea is that once we bake the normal on Spatial, we can see the texture of the stone. A little bit more realistic, or even when you look against the light, just like here on the Sunken Blimp stage, if you look against the light, you can see some of the texture of the stone coming through, and then the lighting itself is a way lower quality, just showcasing the where the light kind of creates shadows, etc. I believe for the size of this is still going to be a little bit rough. Um, sure. So yeah, let's keep with this. Um, and then you're going to see what's going to happen. But basically, what's going to happen is that this is not going to have this, right? So it's going to look like the texture is very, very, very much bigger. Um, let's give it a try. Let's see how this looks in Spatial, at least like so we can see the baking itself. So I select both the gallery and the floor, and then file, export, and then usually the file that I prefer to use the most, especially with like virtual spaces objects, is GLTF. So if you select that one, a couple of things only that we need to change is changing from binary to embedded. So all of the textures are saved within the file. And then within include, just click on selected object. So it doesn't include all of the other stuff that you have in the scene. And then here, let's just call it gallery 3. Yep. And then export. So let's take a look at the file. So the file is 6 MB right now. Here we have a little preview with the huge normal map that looks like it looks really bad. So let's remove this. So I'll remove this for now. And then, also one thing, you see that here there's a couple of seams, right? This is because of the texture that we baked. The margin was not big enough. Uh, but since we have the image here, a lot of times, like a little of these touch-ups you can do in Photoshop. Since this is an image that is saved, you kind of clear out the seams and then you import it again as another image. And you can even modify, like on Photoshop, you can like add stuff like spray paint on the walls. You can be really creative with the textures and then bring it back to the 3D model. So right now, I'm just gonna export this again without the normal. And here we have, it's a 5 MB model. And then let's bring that in. All right, so I'm actually gonna bring this here and do a bigger size. So this is a very simple, light baking, showing how to quickly add some of the lights. If you kind of like try to look in under, you know what? Uh, if I leave, I was like tempted about changing the custom environment into this real quick, but then we're gonna like ruin the Sunken Blimp stage and all of the setups that we have. But so yeah, this is the type of object that you can bring into a platform like Spatial, right? You don't even need to scale it up. You can literally press, if you have a space, you can create a custom environment and then scale this up to the size that you want. And then now all of the floors and the walls, they are geometry that you can walk on and walk around. So this is like a very quick process, well, not a quick process, but like a quick example on how to do baking like this. And then you guys can turn your projects into light given geometry. Is there any questions? Thank you, thank you. You guys have any questions about what I kind of explained, or the process, or what else can happen with this?
Um, I have a question. Is there anything that you have to do additionally to this model to make it so that you can walk on it, or is it just how you imported it that made it so we can walk through it?
So there are two ways. If you were to bring this into something like Unreal or Unity, right, you could create collision blocks so you can walk on, etc. On the case of Spatial, it actually automatic generates collision based on what you imported. So the stage that we're in right now, right? The automatic one is not always the best, right? Sometimes we see someone walking on the audience and they kind of get stuck, but that's an automatic, you know, collision, which is pretty good. It's pretty good. So if I bring this model right now into Spatial and it's set as an environment, it will automatically create all the collisions for the floor. You can walk on the ceiling, on top, etc.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah, so this is ready to go. And then if you look at Spatial documentation, for example, they have a bunch of links on how to do specific things, like, for example, seating hotspots, right? So you can add stools or chairs, benches into your model, and then you can allow people to sit down on them. which is something that we are working on for the version 2 of the Sunken Blimp Stage. Um, and yeah. Thank you, thank you. And if you guys are interested in this type of workshops, like or quick, tutorials, even if it's, in the end we took almost like pretty much an hour to show something. But if you guys are interested in like, even if it's like weekly or bi-weekly, kind of like little tips or something, let us know. Message us on Discord, suggest things. We are organizing this new collection of workshops, right? And we are aiming to have a couple of them live, a couple of them recorded, update them into our YouTube channel as well as our webpage. Kind of have this Sunken Blimp Academy, right, of different quick courses or quick lectures on how to do specific things. Because we've been doing so much exploration with even projection mapping, not only modeling, but projection, augmented reality, virtual reality explorations. And the more people in the community that are interested in these things, learning from us, helping us in a couple of things, like jumping into projects and collaborating and stuff, that would be great. So if you guys are interested, let us know. Comment on Discord. Share the recording of this with someone that wants to learn. And yeah, that would be great. All right, guys. So if that's it, I hope you guys have a wonderful Friday, and I'll catch you all on Discord.